A criticism of preceding systems. Chapter 7. An attack upon dualism and phenomenalism. The critical philosophy of Kant. Modern thought had passed, in the early 18th century, by way of the dualism of Descartes and of Locke, through two phases of a qualitative monism. Under the lead of Hobbes, philosophy had meant materialism. In the hands of Leibniz and Berkeley, it had turned idealistic and spiritualistic. Hume, finally, though as much an idealist as ever Berkeley was, converted the spiritualistic form of idealism into phenomenalism, by conceiving of the universe no longer as a world of spirits, but as a world of evanescent psychic phenomena. Impressions and ideas. Roughly coterminous with Hume's philosophy is the system of the German philosopher, Christian Wolff. Instead of being a modification of idealism, Wolffian doctrine reverts in a curious way to the old dualistic type. Wolff, to be sure, purports to follow Leibniz, but he ignores all the significant teachings of Leibniz, retaining little save the terminology and the inconsistencies of the system. Leibniz teaches that the universe is a community of through and through spiritual beings. Wolff, on the contrary, holds that the ultimate all of reality is a double universe. A world of reality independent of and distinct from any and all consciousness, which would exist if there were no mind or minds to know it, and a parallel world of conscious beings. Thus to every part of the world independent of consciousness, there corresponds, he holds, the consciousness of just this particular reality. Wolff teaches, in other words, as Descartes has taught and as most people uncritically believe, that it is possible to know realities which are yet independent of the consciousness of them. Wolff's system is, in the second place, rationalistic. His rationalism follows, as must be admitted, from an inconsistent teaching of Leibniz. For though Leibniz insists on the continuity of consciousness, and teaches that sense and thought differ, not in kind, but in degree of consciousness, he nonetheless exalts reason over sense, and Wolff emphasizes and perpetuates the distinction, really subversive of Leibniz's teaching. Thus, Wolff teaches that there are two distinct kinds of consciousness: sense and thought. Since he conceives as the relatively superficial, which only confusedly corresponds to the reality independent of consciousness, and which is unable to fathom the deeper realities of the universe, thought, on the other hand, he believes, may attain the knowledge of the independent realities, or substances, and of causality, space and time, unity, and the other rational principles. It has been necessary to outline Wolff's system, though it is unimportant in itself considered, for the most influential of modern doctrines, that of Immanuel Kant, is directly derived from it. Kant's philosophy, in its essential development, is a progressive exploitation of the world of independent reality in favor of that of consciousness. In other words, he discovers, point by point, that forms of thought have no exact parallels in a world of reality independent of them. Corresponding with a sensational consciousness, however, he persistently assumes the existence of independent realities, of realities which are, to be sure, despoiled of all describable characters, a ghost-like world of shadowy objects, whose only quality is the negative one of being other than consciousness and independent of it. Kant's relation to Wolff is thus comparable with the relation of Leibniz to Descartes. Yet though, like Leibniz, Kant modifies dualism in the direction of idealism, unlike Leibniz, he fails to complete his idealistic reconstruction of the universe. This incompleteness follows, doubtless, from Kant's conservatism. He was himself a precise little university professor of fixed habits, and his intellect was of the slow and sure order, which turns and twists traditional doctrines in the effort to gain all their meaning, instead of throwing them rashly away at the first suspicion of their inadequacy. In Kant, this reluctance to discard old forms was combined with an unsparing criticism of doctrines which had not stood the test of prolonged scrutiny. The result of this curious combination of the conservative and the critical tendencies is a system marked by great internal inconsistencies. Kant's system must not, however, be described solely by its affiliation with that of Wolff. For Kant is profoundly influenced also by his study of Hume. From Hume, he derives, in the first place, the suggestion for his criticism of dualism and of rationalism. With Hume, he emphasizes the perceptual nature of space and time, and the ideal character of the forms of thought. But quite as important as the agreement is the opposition between Kant and Hume. Kant, imperceptibly influenced no doubt by Diderot's and by Rousseau's individualism, reinstates the spiritualistic, or personalistic, form of idealism. He replaces Hume's view of the universe as mere conglomerate of impressions and ideas by the older conception of the known universe of conscious selves. Only, as has been pointed out, he retains the dualistic doctrine that there are still realities beyond these selves. But even those who believe, with the writer of this book, that Kant's system includes no teaching new to philosophy, admit its historical importance. It turned back rationalistic philosophy in Germany from the path of dualism re-entered by Wolff, and it rescued idealism from the sheer phenomenalism of Hume. The student of philosophy, therefore, reads Kant, not because his works embody teachings which occur nowhere else, On the other hand, there is little which he taught that cannot be discovered better stated in the doctrines of predecessors or of successors. Nor does one study Kant for the intrinsic worth of his system as such. On the other hand, it must be admitted that his doctrine is incomplete and inconsistent, that the arguments by which he reaches his conclusions are often invalid and still more often unnecessary. Yet the student of modern philosophy must study Kant, because 19th century philosophy of every order has been influenced by Kant's teaching. Post-Kantian idealistic philosophy, both British and continental, is indeed a part of the Kantian system. The blood of Kant flows in its veins. And the most antagonistic forms of British thought have at least been influenced by Kant in the sense that they have been most vigorous in their onslaughts upon him. Thus the systems of friend and of foe alike presuppose on the student's part an acquaintance with Kant. Kant's doctrine of the known object, a refutation of Wolff's dualism and of Hume's phenomenalism. The dualistic doctrine of Wolff forms the starting point of Kant's own thought and, for many years, the basis of his teaching at Königsberg. It may be roughly outlined as follows. World of consciousness. Sense. Sensations of color. Sensations of sound, etc. Thought. Conception of substances. Conception of cause. Conception of space. Conception of time, etc. World of reality independent of consciousness. Real substances. Real causality. Real space, real time, etc. It will be noticed from this scheme that the real world of Wolff resembles that of Descartes. It contains not only substances, but relations, space, time, causality, and the rest. These, Wolff teaches, are independent of consciousness, that is, they would remain real though every conscious being were annihilated. They are known in a twofold way. First, inaccurately and confusedly by the senses, and second, adequately and clearly by thought. Thus, sensations of color, sound, and the like are confused and inadequate representations of the world of independent reality, which itself has no color, sound, or odor. On the other hand, the concepts, or thoughts, of substance, space, time, and causality are correct representations of real substance, space, causality, and so on. In opposition to Wolff and in agreement with Hume, Kant teaches that all known objects are phenomena of consciousness, ideas, and not realities independent of mind. In opposition to Hume, on the other hand, he teaches that the known object is not a mere complex of sensations, but that it includes unsensational characters, namely, relations. These two features of Kant's teaching, its divergence from traditional dualism and its opposition to sensationalism, will appear throughout the summary which follows. The first and earliest part of the Critic of Pure Reason, Kant's most important work, considers the known object as spatial and temporal. 1. Kant's doctrine of the known object as spatial and temporal. Kant's teaching in opposition to Hume that space and time are unsensational and a priori. Kant sharply distinguishes space and time from mere sensations, those of color, odor, and the like. These mere sensations Kant does not discuss at length, but he attributes to them, explicitly or implicitly, 4 characters. They are 1. Many. Kant refers to them as a sense manifold. They are 2. Unordered and chaotic, conglomerate sense material, without form. They are 3. Individual, that is to say, in the same circumstances, one person has one sense experience, while a second person has quite a different one. Finally, 4. The mind in being conscious of sensations is wholly passive, and sensations are therefore due, in some unexplained way, to the reality independent of consciousness. This last character attributed to sensations indicates, of course, the unconquered dualism of Kant. Now, Kant denies that space and time are on a par with these chaotic individual, sense qualities. There are, he teaches, important differences between the changing color of the sky and the spatial relations of the planets, or between the increasing heat of a star and the times of its successive temperatures. These differences reduce to 2. Space and time are distinguished, Kant teaches, from the sense manifold, in that the mind is active, not passive, in the consciousness of them. Space and time, he holds, are further differentiated from sensations, on the ground that both are a priori, whereas sensations are a posteriori. By a priori Kant means universal and necessary. And a priori, that is necessary, truth asserts of something that it could not be otherwise. To universal proposition no exception is possible, it applies, in other words, to every member of a given class. In this sense, Kant teaches, space and time are a priori. There is a necessary relation of every moment to its past and to its future as well, and, similarly, spatial quantities, for example, the circumference and the radii of a circle, are necessarily related. It follows, according to Kant, that space and time are not mere sensations, and since an object, whatever else it may be, is always spatial and temporal, it follows also that the known object is no mere sensational complex. It should be added that Kant, even while he asserts the unsensational nature of space and time, nonetheless regards both space and time as forms of perception. But sensation is admitted to be an essential element of perception, and the wholly unsensational is therefore improperly named perception. It is, however, easy to explain Kant's error in this regard. His account of the space and time consciousness would, indeed, naturally have led him to regard each as a form, not of perception, but of thought, what he later calls a category. But Kant also believes, for reasons which will later appear, that space and time belong to consciousness, and not to a reality independent of consciousness, and he still believes with Wolff that if they were objects of thought, they must be independently real. In a word, he has a dilemma on his hands. Space and time seem to him to be forms of perception and not of thought, and yet they seem to him to be too fixed and too certain to be sensational. He attempts unsuccessfully to solve the problem by creating an imaginary middle state between perception and thought, distinguishing sharply between sensations and space and time, the necessary forms, as he calls them, of perception. 6. Kant's teaching in opposition to Wolff that space and time are subjective. From the a priori, the universality and necessity, of space and time, Kant argues their ideal character. He denies, in other words, that they belong to a world independent of consciousness. The self-conscious being, he argues, knows itself only, and if it makes assertions which have universal validity, in other words, which are a priori, these assertions must be about consciousness, not about any reality independent of consciousness, divorced from it, unknown by it. But there are, Kant teaches, universal space and time truths, wherefore space and time have to do with consciousness, not with the independent reality. Conversely, it is simply because mere sensations have, in his opinion, nothing a priori about them, because he cannot make universal propositions about the sensible qualities of things, that Kant supposes sensations to be due to an unknown, independent reality. For a second reason, Kant argues that space and time are ideal or subjective. Roughly summarized, his argument is the following. The so-called real, or absolute, space and time, belonging according to Wolff to the world of independent reality, would be fixed, immutable, and absolute. Space and time, on the other hand, are full of paradoxes. In remembering, for example, one makes the past present, and in drawing lines through the base of a triangle, one discovers that, according to the principles of mathematics, as many lines can converge in the apex as can be drawn through the base. And the greatest of these paradoxes is the necessity of conceiving space and time both as complete and as endless. We can always, on the one hand, imagine space beyond space. As mathematicians we must, indeed, regard space as infinite. And every past moment must be conceived to have its past behind it, just as every future must be thought of with a future beyond it. On the other hand, space and time, conceived as absolute, must be complete and fixed and immutable. Now such contradictory assertions could not be made, Kant holds, about space and time, if they were realities independent of consciousness. Such paradoxes would, indeed, be impossible with reference to a space and a time which are unaffected by our thoughts about them. On the other hand, consciousness is noted for its contradictions and its paradoxes, and, thus, all the contradictions involved in space and time are accounted for by regarding both as mere forms of consciousness, ways in which we are conscious. Kant concludes that space and time behave like conscious experiences, not like fixed realities, and that they are, in this sense, subjective. The world, he says, meaning not the universe independent of consciousness, but the world of concrete, extended things and successive events, the world does not exist in itself independently of the series of my ideas. Space, he says, elsewhere, is nothing except the form of all phenomena of outer sense. This ideality, he adds, is no bar to the reality of space and time, for both spatial objects and temporal events have empirical reality, and are sufficiently distinct from dream realities. It is unnecessary to discuss at length Kant's arguments for the subjectivity of space and time, since Leibniz, Berkeley, and Hume have gone so much farther by their demonstration that all characters of the known object, sensations along with space and time, are ideal. The importance of Kant's teaching is in its historical relation to the revived dualism of his immediate predecessor, Wolff. Kant deprives the supposed world of non-conscious reality of that character, spatialness, with which Descartes and Locke had endowed it, of which Leibniz and Berkeley had robbed it, with which Wolff has again enriched it. Kant's other teaching about the known object, that certain of its characters are a priori, or universal, has a less important bearing on the main problem of metaphysics, the nature of the all of reality, but is of cardinal importance to Kant's method of attack on the metaphysical problem. This will appear more clearly in the next division of this chapter. 2. Kant's doctrine of the categories, the relations of known objects. Kant's teaching, in opposition to Hume, that the known object includes categories, necessary relations. Hume has insisted that there is nothing in an object save only that which is perceived, remembered, or imagined. In other words, he has taught that an object is a compound of impressions only. Yet Hume has virtually admitted the occurrence of experiences which are not impressions, and Kant is therefore taking the part of Hume against Hume in the teaching that every object contains unsensational as well as sensational elements, that even in perceiving objects, we are conscious of them as more than sensational. The unsensational elements of the known objects, not including the spatial and temporal elements, Kant calls categories, and he recognizes 12 of them, 4 groups of 3 each, to correspond with the classes of judgments treated in formal logic. The categories, Kant teaches, are results of the mind's activity, or better, they are activities of the mind, and are thus distinguished from sensation, for in sense consciousness the mind is merely passive. The categories are furthermore, like space and time relations, a priori, that is, independent of sense experience, universal and necessary. According to Kant, this seems to mean that one may make universal and unqualified assertions and predictions about them. We do not know what will be the sensible qualities of the physical universe 3 billion years from now, but we do know that, whatever its constituents, it must be a totality, that it must be like or unlike the physical universe of this year 1906, and that its present condition is causally, though indirectly, connected with that future condition of it. Or, to take a simpler instance, we cannot predict a priori the sensible character of the event to follow on a present event. A sound or a flash of light may follow on the contact of the wires, but whatever happens will be like or unlike something else, will be the result of what has gone before, and will always be so regarded. In other words, the sensible qualities of future things and events cannot with assurance be predicted, but the unsensational characters of future events and things are predictable, and in that sense universal and necessary. Both because they are predictable and because they imply mental activity, the categories, Kant teaches, are subjective. He argues their occurrence in their unsensational character against Hume, and their subjectivity against Wolff. As so far outlined, Kant's analysis of the world of known objects and, in particular, of perceived objects, has consisted in the teaching that an object is made up, 1. Of sensations, chaotic individual experiences, passively received by the mind, and due to unknown things in themselves, and 2. Of space and time relations, unsensational forms or constructions of the mind itself, corresponding to nothing beyond consciousness, but endowed with a peculiar universality. The chief purpose of his category doctrine, the transcendental logic, as he calls it, is to discuss the remaining characters of known objects, the categories. Among these, however, he lays a special stress on 4, degree, totality, causality, and reciprocal connection, which are relations of a known object within itself or with other objects, and, as such, unsensational factors of experience. In the course of his discussion of the categories, Kant also restates his doctrine of space and time, so that these sections of the critic contain Kant's full doctrine of relations. In this chapter, only Kant's conception of the 4 categories just named is discussed. Kant's procedure throughout the category discussion is the following. He considers objects as perceived, on the ground that these, if any, might be supposed to be purely sensational. And he points out that, even in perceiving objects, we are conscious of them as involving categories. This general statement must be amplified by a consideration of the different categories. 1. The category of totality. In perceiving any object, Kant argues, we are conscious, not merely of its sensational characters, its color, texture, spatial qualities, and all the rest, but we are also conscious of these qualities as belonging together, as combined, fused, unified. And this consciousness of totality, or combination, is an essential feature of the consciousness of an object. In Kant's terms, in perceiving an object, we unify the manifold of impressions of which it is made up. This unity, or totality, may be spatial, but it may conceivably be non-spatial. For example, we are conscious as well of a union of sound, smell, and taste, as of a union of top and bottom, right and left. Kant, however, uses a case of spatial totality to illustrate this truth that a consciousness of unity is a constituent of every percept. I cannot, he says, have the consciousness of any line, however short, without drawing it in imagination, that is, without producing it, part by part, from a point. The illustration is unfortunate, for ordinary observation contradicts its statement of fact. We are most often conscious of small figures, not as connected parts but as simple units, though we sometimes construct complex spatial figures in exactly the slow, reflective way which Kant describes. For example, in imagination we combine geometrical figures into a larger whole, or construct, part by part, some complicated design. But though Kant has pitched on a defective example of perceptual complexity, he is nonetheless correct in his doctrine that perception, the experience of a complex of sense qualities, does include an unsensational consciousness of the holding together, the totality, of these qualities. And he is unquestionably right in the teaching that the relatedness, or totality, of the parts of an object is a priori, necessary, in the sense already indicated. In other words, that without exception and inevitably an object must be conceived as totality of its parts. It should be added that spatial totality is one of the spatial relations already treated in the first division of the Critic, and that it is not easy to account for Kant's failure to recognize the present discussion as in part a repetition of what has preceded. 2. The category of degree, implied in the discussion of the category of reality. Every perceived object includes, Kant teaches, besides the relation of totality, some relation of degree, involving, as is evident, comparison. Kant means that every sensation has a degree of intensity, that is, it is more or less bright or loud or fragrant than other sensations with which it is always compared. In Kant's own words, the real, which is an object of sensation, has intensive magnitude, that is, a degree. That is to say, an object may always be known as being sensationally more or less intense than other objects. Thus, Kant has again established the point which he is making against Hume. The truth of the known object, the phenomenon, as Kant calls it, includes relations, as well as impressions, sensations. For he shows that, in being conscious of the sense qualities of an object, we are conscious always of its degree, that is, of the more or lessness of its color, fragrance, and other sense qualities. He asserts, furthermore, that the degree, the relation of more or less, is a priori, must invariably and inevitably be predicated. There is something which has to do with sensation, Kant says, which may be known a priori. The sensation has intensive magnitude, that is, a degree. Every color, for example, red, has a degree which, however small, is never the smallest possible, and so it is with warmth, with weight, etc. I cannot tell how bright may be the red of this evening's sunset, but I may know that every red sunset will be more or less bright than other sunsets, if not equally bright. In other words, every sensational object involves an a priori relational category of degree. It should be added that these categories of degree are one class only of a larger group, the categories of comparison, on which Kant lays little stress. To this group belong also the categories of sameness and likeness in their opposites. All these categories of comparison are necessary and universal, and, as a class, it must be noted they are different from the connective relations of spatially related objects and temporally related events. 3. The category of phenomenal causality. Every object is known, Kant teaches, not merely as a totality and as comparable with other objects, it is known, also, as causally related. In opposition to Hume, Kant therefore recognizes as constituent of every known object the a priori, that is, necessary and universal, category of causality. Experience, he says, is possible only through the consciousness of a necessary connection of percepts. The essential features of Kant's conception are clear. We know an ordered world of physical phenomena in relation to each other. The world which we know is not composed of isolated objects or of unconnected events. Just as certainly as we experience the color and sound of it, we know the interconnectedness of it, the relation of one object, or event, to the others. Moreover, we know this relation is necessarily and is universally predicable. We cannot, it is true, Kant seems to say with Hume, assert with absolute certainty that any given event is necessarily the effect of any other particular event, but we do know that some effect, whether or not we discover the nature of it, follows necessarily upon a cause. It could never be admitted, Kant insists, that the causal relation is purely imaginary, or that the effect must not be everywhere perceived as determined by the cause. On the contrary, the effect follows without exception and necessarily upon the cause. And from the necessity inherent in the nature of the causal relation, Kant argues the subjectivity, or ideal character, of causality. We are concerned, he says, only with our own ideas. The being of things in themselves, realities independent of consciousness, is entirely outside our sphere of knowledge. We cannot possibly predicate of them any universally admitted relation. The circumstance that we find ourselves universally and necessarily asserting the causal relation is a proof that the causality belongs to the ideal world and not to a world independent of consciousness. The full force of Kant's conception of phenomenal causality is gained only by comparing it with Hume's teaching. It will be remembered that Kant's study of Hume's doctrine of causality formed, as he himself assures us, the point of departure for his own critical philosophy. Hume, he says, awaked me from my dogmatic slumber, and the critic of pure reason, he elsewhere says, was inspired by this Humean doubt. That is to say, Kant's study of the category of causality led to his discovery of the other categories, and this, as will appear, brought him to the formulation of his most important doctrine, that of the transcendental self. the gist of Hume's teaching about causality is, it will be remembered, the following. There is, in the first place, no power or causality in objects existing independently of our consciousness. On the contrary, causality is the anticipated or inferred regular sequence of events, or, more precisely, it is a transition or inference of the imagination. There is, in the second place, no necessary relation between cause and effect. Hume argues this, a. because cause and effect, antecedent and consequent, are distinguishable ideas and therefore not necessarily related, b. because we gain our knowledge of causes through accidental experience, and are never able to predict the effect of a given event, c. because past experience is no guarantee of the future. Kant's agreement with Hume is much farther reaching than is ordinarily supposed. He subscribes without reserve to the first stated of Hume's teachings, and though he denies the second, he admits at least one of its premises. To begin with the most fundamental agreement, Kant is as sure as Hume is that causality is no character or relation of things independent of consciousness, and that, on the contrary, causality is a transition of the mind, a mental connection. What is meant, both philosophers would declare, when it is asserted that the rubbing of sticks together is the cause of a spark, is simply that we, conscious beings, mentally combine the two phenomena in a certain way, that we regard the spark as effect of the friction. The only difference, an important one, to be sure, between Kant and Hume, at this point, is that while Hume describes this mental transition as imagination or belief, Kant calls it thought. The second of Hume's teachings about causality is the denial of a necessary connection between succeeding events. This doctrine is indeed already implied by Hume's account of the causal consciousness as imagination, and as Kant has denied the uncertain character of the causal consciousness, so he disputes the contingency of the connection between phenomena. The causal connection between succeeding events is, he holds, a necessary connection. This important divergence of Kant from Hume must be discussed at some length. Hume argues that events are not causally and necessarily connected on the ground that each event is a separate, self-sufficient phenomenon, and therefore unconnected either temporally or causally with any other. In justified opposition to this, Kant points out that the preceding time necessarily determines the following. We may add, an event means precisely a somewhat which is necessarily connected with its past and with its future, and it is a contradiction in terms to deny the connectedness of one event with another. Kant thus vindicates the necessity of the purely temporal connection. But though the causal connection implies the temporal, it is, as Hume and Kant both recognize, more than temporal. In other words, the doctrine of causal necessity is the teaching that, given a necessary connection between two events, and b, the second event, b, could not have been replaced by any other. Against this sort of necessary connection Hume, it will be remembered, has two arguments. There is, he urges, no necessary, that is, uniform, connection between events, for we gain our knowledge of causality through specific experience. So far from denying this, Kant admits that the logical clearnesses of the causal principle is only then possible when we have made use of it in experience. He does not dispute the accepted doctrine that we are led to the concept of cause by the harmonious relation of many events. But though Kant accepts this, the premise of Hume's argument, he denies the validity of the conclusion which Hume draws from it. Kant teaches, in other words, that the impossibility of knowing with certainty just what will be the nature of a given effect does not impair the certainty that there will be some effect. It is true, he would admit, that the contact of one billiard ball with another may not have as its effect the event which we have foreseen, the motion of the second ball. But it still may be necessarily, that is universally, true. In other words, I may have at any time to admit that some definite effect follows uniformly on the motion of the first billiard ball. Hume has a second argument. Upholders of necessary connection admit that if a cause recur, it must be followed by a recurring effect. Hume denies this uniformity of the causal relation. A past or present experience, he insists, can offer no guarantee for the future. For example, one may not argue from the present relation of spark and flame to the future sequence of one upon the other. Presumably to meet this argument, Kant urges the following consideration. It is admitted, he says, that we know a succession of objects, that is, distinguish an objective from a subjective succession. But objectivity, he holds, is constituted by causality, that is, by necessarily uniform succession. Therefore our knowledge of succeeding objects or events is a guarantee of the causal succession of phenomena. Kant has a well-known illustration of our ability to distinguish objective from subjective succession. When I look at a boat drifting downstream, I must see the boat at the source of the river before I see it at the river's mouth. When, on the contrary, I look at a house, I may successively see the parts in any one of several orders. I may see first the roof and last the cellar, or first the cellar and last the roof. I could not possibly, however, Kant asserts, distinguish the objectivity of the successions of the boat's positions from the subjectivity of the series of ideas of the house, Were not the both's positions linked in a necessary uniform connection, which is lacking to the successive ideas? The fatal flaw in this argument was indicated 20 years later by Schopenhauer. It is not true that the successive ideas of a subjective series are uncaused. To take Kant's example, there is certainly some cause for that position of my head and eyes, which results in my first looking upward to the roof or downward to the cellar of the house, and every successive movement is conditioned by the bodily position or movement which preceded it. Even in the case of a purely imaginary series of ideas, the image of any moment has a cause, physiological or psychical or both in the preceding moment. But since, thus, subjective as well as objective series are causally bound together, it follows that causality, though a character of objective series, is not their distinguishing mark. Kant cannot therefore prove a necessary and uniform connection of events by use of the distinction between objective and subjective succession. But in another section of the Critic he argues in more justifiable fashion for the necessity of causal connection. If the neighbor, he says, turns sometimes red, sometimes black, sometimes light, and sometimes heavy, if a man were transformed now into the shape of this animal and now of that, if on the longest day the earth were covered now with fruits and again with ice and snow, then my empirical imagination would never have occasion on observation of the red color to think of the heavy neighbor. There must therefore be something which, as a priori ground of a necessary synthetic unity of phenomena, makes this very reproduction of phenomena possible. Kant's meaning is clear. Hume had argued somewhat as follows: the heat of this June is an event distinct from next June's heat. Why then must heat be followed by luxuriant vegetation next June as well as this? Kant replies, our experience would not be what it is. In other words, we should not know the world as a connected whole of regularly recurring phenomena if the causal uniformity were not absolutely universal. The writer of this book, like some other critics of Kant, challenges this conclusion. It is obvious, of course, that we expect such uniformity, and that this expectation is implied in our constant assumption of the regularity of nature. But there seems no cogent reason to doubt that we should assume the uniformity on the basis of our past experience, even if a future exception to the uniformity were possible, and even if we were sure of such a possibility. There seems, in other words, no reason to deny that our consciousness of the world as a connected whole might be built up as well on the basis of an ordinarily uniform experience as on the assumption of an inevitably uniform experience. If this criticism of Kant be admitted, it follows that he has not disproved Hume's assertion: the causal and uniform connection of events has not been shown to be absolutely necessary. Yet, as will appear, the failure to demonstrate this necessity does not invalidate the argument based by Kant on his category doctrine. And more than this, in two features of his causality doctrine, Kant has scored against Hume. He has shown, in the first place, the invalidity of that argument, in which Hume denies necessity on the ground that one learns specific causal connections through accidental experience. And he has emphasized, in the second place, the unquestioned necessity, denied by Hume, of the temporal connection of events, the necessity, in other words, of the link between before and after, past, present, and future. 4. The category of reciprocal connection. At least one other relation is discoverable in the experienced world. Besides knowing every object as a totality and as a comparable thing, and besides knowing temporal events as causally connected, we are aware of a necessary connection between untemporal phenomena. This relation has already been implied by that of totality. The line is the whole of its parts, but the parts are necessarily connected one with the other. Indeed, their connection is as necessary as that of a cause with its effect. Similarly, the first term in a binomial series is necessarily connected with the middle term or the last. This form of necessary connection is distinguished, Kant teaches, in the following way from the causal connection. The causal and the temporal series are irreversible. The past is inevitably over before the present. The result may not precede the cause. On the other hand, a reciprocal connection is reversible. Reciprocally connected phenomena may be apprehended in reversible order. One may look from right to left or from left to right of the line, from west to east or from east to west of the spatially related scene. Right and left, east and west are connected, but their order is, nonetheless, reversible. In its application to spatial and to other mathematical quantities, this is evidently the category, emphasized in modem mathematics, of order. B. Kant's teaching, in opposition to Wolff, that the categories are subjective. This discussion of Kant's category doctrine has so far emphasized mainly his opposition to Hume, that is to say, his teaching that the world of known objects includes not merely sensible qualities but a priori, that is necessary and universally predicable, relations. But Kant opposed with equal vigor Wolff's doctrine that these relations occur outside the mind, as links between realities independent of consciousness. In other words, Kant insisted, in agreement now with Hume and the other idealists, that the categories, no less than the sense forms, space and time, and the sensible qualities, color, hardness, and the rest, are themselves subjective or ideal. But the world of known objects consists, it will be admitted, of sense qualities, of the sense forms, space and time, and of the categories, totality, causality, and the rest. Therefore the known or experienced object is an idea, or, to use Kant's term, a phenomenon, and the known world is a world of ordered phenomena, of subjective realities. Kant's main argument for the subjective, or ideal, character of objects as known, has been indicated in the discussions of space, of time, and of causality. He has discovered that these relations are a priori, that is, universally predicable. But of reality independent of consciousness no universal predication may, he says, be made. For realities independent of our consciousness, things in themselves, as Kant calls them, could not affect us, or stand in any relation to us, therefore, they must be, as Kant always teaches, unknown. And obviously, since we do not know them, we can make no universally predicable assertion about them. Whatever is known to be universally true must then, as Kant says, be subjective. In his own words, relation, verbinding, does not in objects and cannot, so to speak, be borrowed from them by sense perception, and so first be taken up into the understanding. On the other hand, connection is exclusively an achievement, Verrichtung, of the understanding. This doctrine of the subjective character of the categories, or relations, is of course in exact opposition to Wolff's teaching. According to Wolff there is a real world independent of consciousness, a world of spatial things and temporal events, linked by relations of unity, causality, and the like. We have, Wolff teaches, thoughts about these things and their relations, but things and relations exist unaffected by our thought. Kant has now plundered this supposed world of things in themselves, not merely of space and time, but of all the relations as well. We know nothing about unity in itself or causality in itself, he teaches. Unity and causality are mental activities, ways in which we think. Kant has thus answered the preliminary questions of his metaphysics, questions concerning the nature of objects and of our knowledge of them. Known or experienced objects simply are, he says, complexes of related sensations. For example, a grape is a complex of blueness, smoothness, coolness, flavor, resembling yet differing from other fruits, and necessarily related to the vine on the one hand and to Rothwain on the other. But sensations and relations are mental experiences. Objects are, therefore, through and through mental, they are ideas, we know them, as Kant says, because we make them. And yet, though ideal, these known objects are, Kant insists, empirically real. They are no visions and illusions, but real concrete things, everyday trees and tables and books. In this teaching of the known object as ideal, or phenomenal, Kant, as has been said so often, merely agreed with Leibniz, Berkeley, and Hume. His significance, at this point, was in his opposition to Wolff, who had gone back to the dualistic standpoint, teaching that there are two kinds of reality, mental and non-mental. Kant himself, as will later appear in more detail, never wholly abandoned Wolff's dualism. He admitted the existence of realities independent of consciousness, things in themselves, and in fact he seems to have regarded our sensations as due to them, but he insisted that these things in themselves are unknown, and that the characters of objects as known are, on the contrary, subjective. The inconsistency and difficulty of the thing in itself doctrine had already been exposed by Hume and by Berkeley, and will, later in this chapter, be discussed. See criticism of Kant's doctrine of the necessity of the categories. Before proceeding to the exposition of Kant's teaching of the subjectivity of the categories, it is best to review and so far as possible to estimate the main results of the category doctrine up to this point. As will appear, Kant's most significant achievement is his emphasis upon the fact that we have not merely sensations but unsensational and, in particular, relational experiences. In the strict sense he does not demonstrate this truth, since it depends for its acceptance on every man's introspection. But he may be said successfully to challenge us, Hume included, to deny the occurrence in our experience of the categories. Now Kant's main contribution to philosophy, the doctrine of the transcendental self, depends, as will later be shown, on no wider conclusion about the categories than precisely this, that our experience includes categories as well as sensations. Kant, however, treats the categories in a far more exhaustive fashion, and in particular attempts to explain the distinction between categories and sensations. As has appeared, he finds that the distinction consists in the universality and the necessity of the categories. The writer of this book believes that Kant does not make good this account of the difference, for though there is indeed a universality in the categories, the same universality and necessity may be predicated of sensations. The main purpose of this section is to formulate this criticism. By the necessary Kant of course means the inevitable, and he recognizes two sorts of necessity, logical necessity and necessity of another kind, nowadays called epistemological. Now, there unquestionably is necessity, logical or, in Kant's terms, analytic necessity, involved in our meanings, conceptions, and definitions. Even Hume admitted the necessity in the case of arithmetical propositions, holding that the square of 3 is necessarily 9, because we mean by the square of 3 what we mean by 9. And similarly, though Hume did not always admit this, the sum of the angles of a triangle is equal to 2 right angles, because we mean by triangle a figure such that the sum of its angles is the sum of 2 right angles, and the future is necessarily connected with the present, because by future, we mean that which is connected with the present. If, then, by necessity is meant the impossibility of not meaning what we do mean, in other words, the impossibility of self-contradiction, Kant is clearly right in asserting the necessity of the categories. But he is as clearly wrong in holding that such necessity distinguishes the categories from sensations. For logically necessary statements may be made as well about sensations as about relations. It is as necessary that what I mean by white is not black as it is necessary that what I mean by 2 times 2 is 4, and it is as necessary that what I mean by rose is fragrant, as that a triangle is the sum of 2 right angles. The necessity in both cases is that of my identical meanings. It should be noted that this denial of Kant's distinction between category and sensation does not involve the admission that the two are indistinguishable. On the contrary, sensations are well marked off from the categories. If the passage of this chapter be reread in which the effort is made to give a plausible meaning to Kant's assertion that the categories, as distinguished from sensations, are universal and necessary, it will be discovered that all which is shown is, 1. The greater observed variety of sensations, and 2. The fact that there are greater observed differences between individuals in their sense experience, resulting in an indisposition to make universal judgments about sense facts. Finally, and most important, 3. The fact that while sensations imply relations, relations do not in the same way imply sensations. I cannot, for example, be conscious of red without being conscious of it as less or more bright, but I can well be conscious of more without having a consciousness of red. It follows that I must predict certain relations in predicting any sensations, whereas I am unlikely to predict these particular sensations in asserting relations. Thus, to summarize Kant's teaching about sensations and categories, he has rightly taught that the categories are necessary. If by necessary he means inevitably self-consistent, but he has wrongly treated this necessity as a distinction between sensations and relations. In truth, logically necessary statements may be made about sensations, and their actual distinction from the categories is to be found mainly in what may be named their greater variableness. But it must now at once be pointed out that Kant does not mean by the necessity of the categories the merely logical, or, as he calls it, analytical, necessity of which we have so far spoken. In attempting to justify Kant's assertion of the necessity of space, time, and the categories, we have in fact conceived this necessity in an un-Kantian fashion. It is true that Kant recognizes logical necessity, but he expressly teaches that space, time, and the categories have a necessity of another sort. To make clear Kant's meaning, it will be necessary, first, to state his distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. Analytic judgments, Kant teaches, add nothing through the predicate to the subject, but merely analyze the subject into the partial concepts, Teilbegriff, which are already thought in it though confusedly. Synthetic judgments add to the conception of the subject a predicate which was not at all contained in it, and which could not have been extracted from it by analysis. As example of analytic judgment, Kant gives all bodies are extended, holding that extension is a constituent of my conception of body. The judgment all bodies are heavy is, on the contrary, according to Kant, a synthetic judgment. For heaviness, he says, does not belong to the concept of body. To this distinction of the synthetic from the analytic judgment, Kant now adds the distinction of the a priori from the a posteriori judgment, the judgment which is universal and necessary from that which is individual and contingent. He attempts, moreover, to coordinate the two sets of distinctions to decide, in other words, whether analytic and synthetic judgments respectively are a priori, a posteriori, or of both kinds. Now, analytic judgments are one and all a priori, and, therefore, it is everywhere and without exception true that the characters which a concept includes may be predicated of it. This is the sort of necessity which in this book, and especially in this chapter, has been defended as valid necessity. A more important question in Kant's view is the following. Are synthetic judgments, judgments of discovery, ever necessary, a priori? It is evident at first blush that one whole class of synthetic judgments lack this necessity. These are the judgments which one makes through one's particular experience, which are one and all contingent or a posteriori. From the fact that I have, for example, found that metals are heavy, I may not rightly infer that without exception all metals are heavy. Kant admits, in other words, that most synthetic judgments are a posteriori, contingent. He insists, however, that besides these contingent synthetic judgments of experience there is another class of synthetic judgments, those which are a priori, or necessary. These, he asserts, are the judgments about space, time, and the categories. In other words, Kant supposes that causality and the other relations have a necessity quite different from the logical or analytic necessity. For a thoroughgoing estimate of this teaching there is not time, but the following comment may be made. Kant never justifies his assertion that the necessary, a priori, judgments, which may certainly be made about space, time, and the categories, are synthetic as well as necessary. In other words, Kant rightly asserts the necessity of such judgments as 5 plus 7 equals 12. The future follows on the present, but he never proves the truth of his assertion that these a priori judgments are synthetic. It must be confessed that he only once, in the case of causality, even attempts the proof, and the truth is that the causal principle loses necessity whenever it becomes synthetic, whenever, in other words, it seeks to prophesy uniformity. And yet it may be pointed out that Kant suggests the occurrence of necessity, other than the purely logical necessity of analytic judgments. His teaching about the a priori implies the doctrine that, since we undeniably have knowledge, or experience, of some sort, therefore the invariable constituents of knowledge are necessary. Now the categories, or relations, are in this sense epistemologically as well as logically necessary, since they belong to experience, and thus make it possible. In precisely similar fashion, however, sensations may be said to be necessary, since they, too, are always a constituent of our experience. A brief restatement of this critical section will conclude it. In the view of the writer, Kant has 1. Proved that relations are parts of our experience, and this is all which the main argument of the critic requires of his category doctrine. In the attempt, 2, to distinguish categories from sensations he has a. Rightly attributed necessity to space, time, and the categories, but b. Wrongly denied the same sorts of necessity to sensations. He has made this mistake because 3. He wrongly regards the necessary judgments about space, time, and the categories as synthetic, that is, as involving a necessity other than the logical impossibility of self-contradiction. B. Kant's doctrine of the self and of the object is related to the self, in opposition to Hume. 1. Kant's argument for the existence of a self. According to Kant, the universe of reality includes not merely unknown things in themselves and known objects, but includes also a self, or knower. This teaching of Kant is of extreme significance in that it directly opposes Hume's teaching that a self, or knower, does not and cannot exist, and that the universe is a mere kaleidoscopic succession of ideas. Kant founds his doctrine, that a self exists, in the first place, on simple introspection. Hume argues that the succession of ideas makes up the whole of what we know. But these ideas, Kant points out, may at any moment be claimed as my ideas. In truth, I am never conscious of ideas which are nobody's ideas. That is to say, in knowing the existence of ideas, I know the existence of a self or of selves. But besides asserting, as a fact of immediate experience, the existence of the self, Kant proceeds to argue that certain characters, which we attribute to ideas, really belong to a self, and therefore imply its existence. In more detail, Kant's argument is as follows. We are, in the first place, conscious of the identity of certain experiences with others. The consciousness of the identity of the present with the past is, in truth, the essence of recognition. Kant lays stress upon the synthesis of recognition as he calls it. We have, as he points out, the consciousness that what we think is the same as that which we thought a minute ago. Now this identity cannot, Kant insists, belong to the ideas themselves. For, as idea of a particular moment, each idea is distinct from every other, far from being identical with it. If, therefore, as Hume contends, there were no self, if the word self were merely a name for a succession of ideas, then one idea never could be looked upon as identical with another which had gone before, and no one even could say, this is the same view, or bird note, or conclusion. For today's landscape, or sound, or reflection is a different idea, a distinct experience, from yesterday's. Yet we do have the experience of identity, in other words, we do recognize, and the fact that identity may not be attributed to ideas leaves us but the one way to account for the existence of identity. The consciousness of identity is really, thus, the consciousness of the one and identical self. In the second place, Kant argues the existence of the self from a more general character of the series of ideas. Not merely the one relation of identity, which we attribute to ideas, but all relations of ideas to other ideas, that is, the general fact of the relatedness of ideas implies, Kant says, the existence of a relating or unifying self. In his own words, the consciousness of relation can be created only by the subject, for it is an act of itself activity. Kant is content with this assertion that relatedness implies a self as relator. The proposition is, however, so important that it must be dwelt upon with more than Kant's emphasis on it. Kant has established the fact that the known world is a world of related objects, that is, of related ideas. But, as Hume has shown, an idea, in itself considered, is an isolated and self-sufficient fact. The idea of one moment is indeed over before that of another begins, so that there is nothing in one idea which may relate it to a second. It follows that relations do not exist as parts of ideas, and yet it has been shown already that all relations are subjective, that they exist in the world of consciousness, not in a world independent of reality. But since ideas are, as a matter of experience, in relations of causality, identity, and the like, to still other ideas, these relations, which belong neither to objects independent of consciousness nor to objects as known, ideas, must be characters of a self, and a self must exist because ideas are related, because they cannot relate themselves, and because no reality independent of consciousness relates them. Kant's argument for the existence of a self has real value. Before Hume's time, philosophers, once they have established the reality of consciousness, do not need to argue for the existence of selves, for consciousness is simply assumed to mean selves who are conscious. Hume, however, challenges this assumption. He teaches, to be sure, that the universe consists, through and through, of consciousness, but he conceives of consciousness as mere succession of ideas. Kant now restores selves to their rights. A world of consciousness must be, he insists, the world of a conscious self which has ideas, for the ideas, and in particular the identity and the relatedness of the ideas, imply the existence of an identical and unifying self. No self, no ideas; if ideas, then a self. Such, in brief, is Kant's answer to Hume. And the universe of reality, as so far formulated by Kant, contains 1. Related objects which have turned out to be complexes of sensations and relations, 2. The self which knows them, and 3. Unknown things in themselves. 2. Kant's doctrine of the nature of the self. The existence of known objects, that is, of ideas, has thus been shown by Kant to imply the existence of a conscious self. Kant does not, however, for a reason which will later appear, make use of the word self or spirit. In their place, he employs such expressions as the subject, the I think, and still more often the awkward expression unity of apperception, doubtless chosen in order to emphasize the self, as contrasted with the evanescent plurality of the successive momentary ideas. In this chapter the non-Kantian term self is retained, for the sake of brevity and clearness. No part of Kant's philosophy has more constructive value, and none has had more historical significance than his doctrine of the nature of the self. The most characteristic feature of this doctrine is the distinction which he makes between the transcendental self, as he calls it, and the empirical self. A. The transcendental and the empirical self. Heretofore, philosophers have distinguished only between finite selves and infinite self. Kant finds the conception finite self too crude to do justice to the complexity of self-consciousness, but the distinction by which he seeks to enrich it, the distinction between transcendental and empirical self, is, as will appear, vague and indecisive. 1. He first distinguishes the transcendental self, as identical, from the empirical self, as momentary. Already, in the argument for the existence of a self, Kant has shown how the self, as identical, is contrasted with the idea, as momentary. Now the momentary idea may be idea of a self; as such, it is empirical self and is distinguished from the transcendental, the identical, self. At any particular instant there are present to my consciousness not only the varying complexes of ordered sensations constituting my percepts of desk and bookshelves and window and road, but a certain complex, chiefly of organic sensations, effectively toned, which makes up my this moment's idea of myself. This way that I feel at this particular moment is contrasted both with the perceptive outer object, and also with the experienced self that cannot be broken up into moments, with the identical, more than momentary, one self of which each of us is conscious, the self which remembers and feels and intends, instead of consisting of memory, image or feeling or purpose. Now the identical self is what Kant means, primarily, by his transcendental unity of apperception, and his empirical self is, from this point of view, the shifting self which varies with every change of environment, which alters in the process of youth to age and in the progress of disease. The empirical self is, in fact, Kant says, a many-colored self, or rather, it is a series of selves, each one a distinct idea, whereas the transcendental self is my own deeper underlying identical self. 2. The transcendental is contrasted with the empirical self is, in the second place, a thinking, categorizing, active, not a sensationally conscious passive, self. This is evident from the very name which Kant applies to it, synthetic unity of apperception, and from the nature of the argument which he advances for the existence of a self. It is the transcendent more than momentary self for which he argues, and he establishes the truth of its existence, it will be remembered, solely on the ground that there must be a unifier, a relator of the sense manifold. Such a unifying, relating self is a thinking self. 3. A final important character is attributed by Kant to the transcendental I. It is not merely an identical and a thinking, but a universal self, one universal self-consciousness, as he declares. We have next, therefore, to discover how he argues that the self is universal and what he means by its universality. Both problems will be found to involve us in difficulty. In brief, he argues its universality from the discovery that there are things outside me, and our study of his conception of the self leads, therefore, to a discussion of his conception of the thing outside me, and of his argument for its existence. There is a sharp distinction, so Kant teaches, quite in harmony with everyday philosophy, between my private ideas, Vorstellung, and the things outside me, or things in space. It is true that, according to Kant, these things outside me are known objects, and as such that they are themselves ideas, or related sensation complexes, but they differ utterly from the ideas peculiar to a single self, the ideas of a self as particular. Between an object in space and the ideas, percepts or images, called up in different minds by the same object, there is, Kant thus insists, a difference, though the thing outside me is itself idea. For example, between my own particular sight or percept of a stone, or your percept of it, and the stone outside me, there must be a distinction, else we could not, Kant observes, make general assertions about objects. We could not say the thing is heavy, but merely the thing feels heavy to me, nor could we distinguish imagination from perception. Thus, generalization and perception both imply, Kant teaches, a thing outside me, and not the mere consciousness of a thing outside me. In other words, to our percepts, äußeren Anschauungen, there corresponds something real in space. This thing outside me or real object in space is not, we must once more remind ourselves, an object independent of consciousness. In the sense of the dualists, Locke and Descartes, in Kant's own terms, it is not a thing in itself. Such a view, however tempting, is impossible. For the thing in itself, Kant always teaches, is unknown, whereas the real object in space, though it is not your or my exclusive possession, yet is a thing that you and I know, and is therefore an idea. The problem is to reconcile these two conditions. To discover an idea, or phenomenon, which yet is a real thing in a sense in which our percepts, as particular, are not real. Kant's solution of the problem is the following. He conceives of the real things in space as objects of the transcendental self, and contrasts them with the mere ideas, the ideas of empirical selves. The real things are, thus, external to the empirical self, but they are the ideas, or objects, of the transcendental self. The pressing question of Kantian interpretation is then the following. What, concretely, is the self whose object is no mere percept or image, but a real thing, though at the same time an idea? It is very difficult to find Kant's answer to this question. Berkeley has answered it by the doctrine that it is God whose object or idea is the external thing. Fichte and Hegel are yet to answer it by the teaching that the transcendental self is an absolute, or including, self. The universal self, they hold, whose object is a real thing, must be a self which is greater than the finite selves, and which in some sense includes them. Thus interpreted, the transcendental self is a more than finite self, the empirical selves are particular, finite selves, related to the including self, as the momentary states to the finite yet identical self, and real things, objects of the transcendental or including self, are in one sense external to the finite selves, and yet are known by them in so far as they, the finite selves, shape in the consciousness of the greater self which includes them. In the view of the writer, this post-Kantian doctrine truly offers the only answer to the question which Kant himself has raised. How account for the existence of real things distinguished from the ideas of finite selves? But Kant, though he states the problem and, indeed, by the distinction between greater and lesser self, provides terms for this Hegelian solution of it, never himself reaches this result. By transcendental self he seems to mean not an absolute self which includes finite selves, but any finite self, you, I, he, or Friedrich der Grosse, in its universalizing consciousness of real things. Thus, besides being a particular self and as such possessed of percepts and imaginations of my own, I am also, Kant seems to teach, a transcendental, universal self which perceives objects realer than those of the particularizing, momentary, empirical self, objects which are in a sense outside that empirical self. Thus, for example, Immanuel Kant, as empirical self, may stand at his window imagining his lecture room, and even having his own special percept of the view before him, but Kant as transcendental self is conscious also of objects, of the real Königsberg Street and church in Rathaus, and these objects might be facts in the experience of all human beings, instead of being, like the image of the lecture room, an idea belonging to oneself only. In a word, Kant seems to imply that the different transcendental selves overlap each other, that you and he and I, as conscious of the same object, have somehow a common experience. He seems never to realize that such common experience is impossible, if there be not an including self, that, in truth, a universal self is of necessity absolute self. b. The subject in the object's self. Besides the distinction between identical and universalizing, or transcendental, self and momentary and particular, or empirical, self, Kant recognizes a contrast between subject self and object self. A difference indicated by the words I and me. When I say, I am conscious of myself, I seem, at least, to make a difference between the self as subject and the self as object. Kant fails to observe that this distinction is not a primary or a fundamental one. It seems to arise through carrying back into the domain of self-consciousness the relation which first exists between the self and the thing. I know the thing through contrasting it with myself, and so, by later abstraction, I believe myself to know myself by distinguishing a subject from an object ego. Really, self-consciousness is a single unified experience, and subject self and object self are poles within consciousness. The greatest difficulty in Kant's exposition of the self is now the fact that he sometimes treats the distinction between subject self and object self as if it were identical with the contrast between transcendental and empirical ego. That is to say, he sometimes identifies the transcendental with the subject ego, and less constantly the empirical with the object ego. He teaches, in other words, that the self is knower only and not itself known, that, on the other hand, the self is known as the lesser, the empirical, self. It will be well to summarize the results, already outlined, of Kant's positive teaching, before going on, as we must, to the study of his negative doctrine. Kant started, it will be remembered, from the standpoint of the Wolffian dualism. He conceived the universe as consisting, 1. Of things in themselves, realities independent of consciousness, substances spatially and temporally ordered and causally related, and 2. Of conscious minds which know these things. This dualistic view may be symbolized thus: the universe, consciousness, things in themselves. But Kant, partly through the influence of Hume, little by little discovered that space, time, substance, and causality, all the positive characters of the world independent of consciousness, really are subjective and ideal. Thus he taught that known objects are simply sensations ordered by certain relations. These relations, he argued further, require and imply the existence of a self. In place, therefore, of the old distinction between consciousness and things, Kant now recognized a double opposition. First, that of self to object or thing, each regarded as within the world of consciousness, and second, that of consciousness, including both self and object, to reality independent of consciousness, that is, to things in themselves. The teaching of this stage of Kant's idealism may be represented, thus: the universe, consciousness, things in themselves, consciousness, selves, things. Kant's positive philosophy is thus the doctrine of the self and the known thing. But his conception of the self becomes complex. He contrasts, 1. The self as knower, or subject, with the self as known, or object, thus attributing to the self the term, object, heretofore reserved for the thing or the idea. He also, 2. Contrasts the self as identical and universalizing with the self as momentary and particular, indicating the last two distinctions by one pair of terms, transcendental and empirical. Corresponding with this complexity of the self, Kant recognizes a distinction in the class of known objects, according as they are ideas of the self as transcendental, or of the self as empirical. These distinctions are included in the following rough summary, but it is not possible to indicate, by the summary, the relations between self and thing, subject and object, namely, that the transcendental self is knower, both of the empirical, or evanescent, self, and of its own categorized sense objects, the things outside me, and that the empirical self may be regarded as conscious both of itself and of its ideas. The universe, consciousness, things in themselves, consciousness, selves, objects, subject self, transcendental empirical, object self, empirical, things outside me, particular ideas. See Kant's negative teaching that ultimate reality is unknown. From this summary of Kant's positive teaching, it is necessary now to turn to the negative doctrine on which he seems to lay equal stress. He teaches unambiguously that not only a world of things independent of consciousness, but also the transcendental self and God are unknown. These teachings must be separately summarized and estimated. 1. The doctrine of things in themselves is unknown. From the earliest years of his teaching to the very end, Kant clings to the belief, in which he has been bred, that there exists a world of realities independent of and unaffected by our consciousness of them. He diverges, however, from the traditional doctrine in insisting that we cannot know these objects as they really are, the things in themselves. Not the slightest statement, he says, is to be made a priori concerning the thing in itself, which may lie at the basis of phenomena. This doctrine involves a conception of the nature of things in themselves, an argument for their existence, and a proof that they are unknown. Three essential aspects must be emphasized of the things in themselves, as Kant conceives them. They are, first, by hypothesis, independent of consciousness, other than consciousness, and out of relation with it. This is the force of the predicate in themselves is, which indicates the self-sufficiency, the utter independence, of these non-mental realities. The things in themselves are regarded, in the second place, as ultimately real. The objects of experience, the objects which turn out to be the ideas of a mind, are called phenomena, that is, appearances, in contrast with them. And because of their supposedly superior reality, it seems to Kant a serious loss not to know the things in themselves. Finally, the things in themselves, as conceived by Kant, lack all characters save that of mere existence. Space and time, substantiality and causality, attributed by Wolff to the reality independent of consciousness, have been regained by Kant for the objects of experience. The alleged world of things in themselves is thus despoiled of all positive characters. The discovery that the things in themselves are thus empty of positive reality raises the question: why does Kant hold so unswervingly to the bare and useless existence of them? The truth seems to be that, on the basis of the dualism in which he has been bred, he simply takes for granted, without argument, that things in themselves exist. The only arguments which he suggests are the following. He says, to begin with, that in order that there may be appearances, there must be something real of which they are the appearances. He suggests, in the second place, that sensations, since they are arbitrary, must be caused by things independent of us. The truth, however, is, as has been said, that Kant assumes and hardly attempts to argue the existence of these things in themselves. Kant's teaching that the things in themselves, thus conceived and argued, are unknown is most vigorously stated in his section on phenomena and noumena. It begins with a forcible metaphor. We have now, Kant says, traveled through the land of pure understanding. But this land is an island and is confined, by nature herself, within unchangeable bounds. It is the land of truth, an alluring name, surrounded by a wide and stormy sea, the very domain of illusion, where many a fog bank and many an iceberg, soon to melt away, falsely suggest new lands. But before we venture out on this sea, it will be wise to cast a glance upon the map of the land which we are ready to abandon, and first to ask whether we might not be content with what it contains, whether in fact we must not be content with this land, if there be nowhere else a footing. It at once appears that spite of the existence of the sea of unexperienced reality, we must indeed be content with this island of experience, for, dropping his metaphor, Kant argues, as he has so often argued, that our knowledge is by its constitution incapable of apprehending ultimate reality. The reason which Kant assigns for this restriction of knowledge to the world of appearance is, briefly, the following: that our knowledge always includes sensation, and that sense knowledge cannot reach, what it nonetheless implies, ultimate reality. This teaching is reiterated throughout the Critic. One whole section, ostensibly devoted to the discussion of the categories of modality, is really given over to the teaching that what is actual is always, for us, sensational. And the section now under consideration says emphatically, the understanding can never overstep the limits of sense. Only through its sense condition can a category have a definite meaning, for a category can contain only a logical function, through which alone without sense consciousness nothing can be known. And because of this inevitable sense factor in knowledge, the mind, so Kant teaches in the second place, should never make a transcendental use of any of its concepts, that is, it should never apply its concepts to things in themselves. It follows that Kant's gallant rescue of the categories, the unsensational factors of experience, from Hume's attack has not, in his own opinion, any bearing on the problem of the nobleness of reality. According to Wolff, relational or thought consciousness guarantees the independent reality of its object, whereas sense consciousness is, in its nature, illusory. But Kant points out that thought is always mixed with sense, that our knowledge always has the sensational taint, and, accepting Wolff's doctrine that the object of sense is mere phenomenon, he concludes that the reality independent of our consciousness is unknown. This brief exposition of the doctrine of the unknown things in themselves must be supplemented by an estimate of it. From the start, suspicion has attached to it, for it has been discovered that Kant himself does not consistently hold it. The things in themselves belong, by his definition, to reality independent of consciousness, and such reality cannot be known because the categories cannot be applied to it. Yet Kant conceives it sometimes as thing, sometimes as object, thus implying either its plurality or its unity, and he speaks of it either as actual, or at least as possible, thus applying some one of his categories of modality. More than once also he treats this independent reality as causally related to sense experience. Thus he says, the word appearance indicates a relation to something which must exist in itself, that is to an object independent of sense. And in another passage he refers to a transcendental object which is the cause of the phenomenon. Truth to tell, this inconsistency is rooted deep in a fundamental difficulty of the thing in itself doctrine. Things in themselves are, by hypothesis, independent of consciousness, yet they must be talked about and thought about if they are to be inferred as existing. They are drawn, thus, into the domain of the self, they become objects of consciousness, no longer independent realities. The self-contradiction of Kant's teaching that things in themselves must exist is thus so evident that the comments on his specific arguments may without harm be abbreviated. In support of the existence of things in themselves, he first argues, it will be remembered, that they must exist to cause sensations. But this implies, what Kant denies, that they are categorized objects. Another argument for the existence of things in themselves is by the assertion that mere phenomena, or manifestations, require something to manifest, a reality of which they are appearance. Upon this reasoning, two criticisms may be made. On the one hand, the argument is illicit, for it applies a category, that of substance, to the things in themselves, which, by hypothesis, are uncategorized. In the second place, the argument is insufficient, for it proves only the existence of some reality more ultimate than phenomena, and leaves open the possibility that this more ultimate reality is nothing but a self. Kant's proof that things are unknown may be even more briefly treated. It rests on the two propositions that knowledge involves sensation, and that the object of sensational consciousness is, ipso facto, unreal. Both propositions are mere assumptions, and for the second, no proof can be found. As a whole, then, Kant's thing in itself doctrine breaks under its own weight. He has not proved that things in themselves, if they exist, are unknown. He has not proved that they exist, and, most important of all, he has not even a right to the bare conception of them, since it involves him in a logical contradiction. 2. Kant's doctrine of the real self is unknown. To the world of ultimate reality which Kant contrasts with that of appearances or phenomena, there may belong, he teaches, not merely things in themselves, that is, realities independent of consciousness, but also real, or transcendental, selves. These selves, he adds, like the things in themselves, must be unknown. This assertion that the real or transcendental selves are unknown is, it must be observed, more important than the parallel teaching about things in themselves. For by the teaching that beyond the domain of self and its object, there exist realities which may not be known, Kant simply indicates that the world of selves and their objects is a part only of reality. But by the doctrine that the transcendental ego, the real self, the permanent I, is unknown, Kant narrows the world of the known, subtracting from it the only ultimate realities which it contains. Kant does not, it will be observed, deny the existence of the transcendental selves, or self, nor does he, like Hume, deny the possibility of self-knowledge. But he insists that only the empirical, the lesser and fragmentary self, can be known, teaching that the true self, though unquestionably existing, cannot constitute an object of knowledge. It is true, he admits, that we infer its existence as the necessary unifier of experience, but the only self which we ever catch, so to speak, the only describable, known self, is just a sum of percepts, feelings, and memories, a momentary, particular, empirical ego. In Kant's own words, I, as intelligence and thinking subject, know myself as thought object, not as I am, but as I appear to myself. More unequivocally, I am conscious of myself, in the synthetic original unity of apperception, not as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself. I am conscious only that I am. This doctrine, it is obvious, is of grave import, for it takes away our knowledge of the only significant self, the only self which has permanence, the only self to which moral worth or immortality might be attributed. The known empirical self reduces, indeed, to an ego closely resembling Hume's mere bundle of perceptions. The heavy consequences, thus foreshadowed, of this doctrine, predispose one to a critical examination of Kant's arguments for it. These are two. The first is derived from Kant's conception of knowledge, and from his conception of the nature of the transcendental self. On the one hand, he teaches, 1. That all knowledge must include sensation, yet, 2. That knowledge, just because it contains sensation, is incapable of attaining unphenomenal reality. And, on the other hand, he teaches that the transcendental self is a categorizing, unifying self, not a complex of sensations, and that it is therefore a more than phenomenal reality. It follows that the self, just because it is the deepest kind of reality, cannot be known, since knowledge includes sensation, and since sensation cannot reach the non-phenomenal. This means that all objects of knowledge, including even the self as known, must be phenomenal objects, that is, mere appearances, in comparison with the realities independent of consciousness. In Kant's own words, the consciousness of oneself is far from being a knowledge of oneself, just as I need for the knowledge of an object distinct from me not merely thought, but also a perception, so also I need for the knowledge of myself, besides the fact that I think myself, a perception also of the manifold within me. Before going on to outline Kant's second argument for the unknowableness of the transcendental ego, it will be well to estimate the value of the first. The implicit assumptions of this argument have been enumerated, and a brief consideration will make clear that, while several of them may be admitted, one at least will be sharply challenged. It may be admitted, in the first place, that the transcendental self is a more than fragmentary and an ultimate reality. It is also true that we have always found not merely what we call out knowledge, but all our consciousness to contain sensations. In other words, we have never found ourselves conscious without at the same time seeing or hearing, smelling or tasting or feeling, singly or together. To be sure, the sensational factor of our experience often is unemphasized and unattended to, but, as far as our past and present experience goes, it is always present. But this fact offers no warrant for Kant's conclusion that because our knowledge is, in this meaning, sensational, therefore it may not have as object any ultimate reality. Of course, it is true that my consciousness of myself is much more than sensational, and this is doubtless the foundation of Kant's doctrine, but this fact does not hinder my being both sensationally conscious and conscious of myself. The two experiences are not irreconcilable. The sensations are either coincident with the self-consciousness or even unemphasized parts of it. When Dante, for example, first saw Beatrice, he was conscious of her red robe, but the presence of the sensational consciousness did not prevent his soul meeting hers, in a word, did not affect Dante's knowledge of Beatrice. Thus, to recapitulate, Kant's first argument to prove the transcendental self unknowable is invalid, mainly because it argues, without adequate foundation, that where sensation is their ultimate reality is not. Kant's second argument for the doctrine that the transcendental self is unknown is formulated in a later part of the Critic. In brief, this argument is the following. Knowledge involves the distinction between subject and object, that is, between the I and the me, but if the transcendental self were known, it would itself be both subject and object, both in myself, and this is impossible, for so the necessary distinction between subject and object would be lost. Kant sees in this contradiction a support for his doctrine that the transcendental self is pure subject, or knower, without being object, or known. Through this I or hear it, the thing, which thinks, nothing except a transcendental subject of thoughts is represented. For Gestell equals X, of which, in abstraction, we can have no slightest idea. About this I we revolve in an inconvenient circle, since we must have a consciousness, Vorstellung, of it to come to any conclusion about it. 25 years later, Herbert restated just this difficulty in great detail. Who, or what, he asks, is the object of self-consciousness? The answer must be, the I is conscious of itself. This itself is the I itself. One may then substitute this concept of the I, and then the first proposition will be transformed into the following. The I is conscious of itself as being conscious of itself. Let the same substitution be repeated, and there results. The I is conscious of that which is conscious of that which is conscious of itself. This circle will run on forever, and it follows that the question is unanswerable, and that the I is a never complete but always to be completed problem. It has already been shown that Kant's solution of the difficulty consists in assuming that the necessary distinction between subject and object self is obtained by regarding the subject self as transcendental, or identical and universal, and the object self as empirical, or changing and particularizing. The self which I know is always, in other words, the self of the moment, the way I feel or imagine or decide at this particular moment, and I do not know, I am merely conscious, of the identical, universalizing I, which knows, but is not known, which is subject, not object. It must at once be admitted that this doctrine meets the difficulty which was stated. As Kant says, both the suggested conditions of self-knowledge are, in this way, fulfilled. Self knows self, and yet there is a distinction between self as knower, the transcendental self, and self as known, the empirical self. Yet this conception of the transcendental self as knower and not known has its own insuperable difficulty. It is clearly self-contradictory. In the very act of saying that the transcendental self is knower, not known, subject, not object, Kant admits the necessary existence of such a self, and anything which must be said to exist is surely known, at least as existing. Kant's doctrine that the transcendental self exists implies, therefore, the admission that it is known. So Kant is left with the alleged contradiction of self-consciousness, subject-objectivity, on his hands. He has brought the contradiction forward as proof of his doctrine that the transcendental self is subject only, never object or known, but it appears that an existent transcendental self must be, to some degree, a known self. If then a self is necessarily conceived as known self, and if the conception of a known self involves hopeless contradiction, Kant's whole doctrine of the transcendental self is endangered. In this extremity, the critic of Kant may point out that the difficulty which this discredited conception was framed to meet is itself artificial, in other words, that self-consciousness is not in its essential meaning subject-objectivity. Our awareness of self is in truth a fundamental experience, a primarily immediate certainty, and it is but inadequately expressed in terms of the later and more artificial opposition of object and subject. a distinction borrowed from the contrast of self with external things. There is thus no need of proving that I know a transcendental, that is, a universalizing and an identical self, for I am immediately aware of such a self, and the opposition of object to subject self is an addition of later reflection. This refutation of the last of Kant's arguments for the unknowableness of the transcendental self sends us back with renewed confidence to his own arguments for the existence of this self, and restores to his universe of reality the significant figure which he himself has tried to banish. 3. Kant's doctrine of God is unknown. By his doctrine that only sense objects and empirical, or changing, selves can be known, Kant has implicitly taught the impossibility of knowing God. In the first section of the dialectic, however, he argues explicitly that the existence of God cannot be proved. By God, he says, is meant a being which includes all reality in itself, a supreme being to whom everything is subject. The unknowability of God, thus conceived, is argued by Kant through a destructive criticism of the three traditional arguments for the existence of God. Of these, the first is the ontological proof. Kant states it in the form in which Anselm held it. The realist of all beings contains all reality, and one is justified in assuming that such a being is possible, but existence is included in all reality. Therefore existence belongs to the concept of a possible being. If, now, this thing does not exist, the inner possibility of it is denied, and this denial is a contradiction. More simply, the concept of an absolutely real being, that is God, is possible. But absolute reality includes existence. Therefore the absolutely real being must be conceived as existing. Therefore, finally, he does exist. Kant makes short and easy work of this argument. It depends, as he shows, on the false supposition that conceived existence and real existence are synonymous. As a matter of fact, not everything which is conceived is real. To be conscious of 100th thaler is surely not the same as to possess the 100th thaler. In other words, one may be conscious of the existent, and yet that which is thought of as existing does not necessarily exist. Thus, the fact of our representing to ourselves an all-perfect being is not any guarantee for such a being's existence. The cosmological is the causal argument for God's existence. Kant states it very clearly in the passage which follows. If anything exists, he says, an absolutely necessary being must exist, for every contingent thing must have its cause, and this cause, if contingent, must have its cause till the series of subordinate causes end in an absolutely necessary cause, without which the series would have no completeness. Now, at least I myself exist, therefore an absolutely necessary being exists. The argument is familiar, for Descartes, Leibniz, Berkeley, and even Hobbes have employed it. It is based on two principles. The first expressed in the proposition, every limited or contingent reality must have a cause. The second formulated in the statement, every limited reality must have, not merely a partial, but a completely explanatory, and ultimate cause. To the first of these principles Kant, as we know, assents, teaching unequivocally that everything, or, to be more exact, every event has a cause. But the universality of this causal principle does not, Kant insists, imply an ultimate cause. All that it requires is that the causal series of contingent beings never at any particular point came to an end, in other words, that every contingent cause, however far back in the series, should itself have a cause. But Kant is not content with arguing that the first and incontrovertible causal principle does not imply the second, that is to say, that the universality of the causal relation does not imply the existence of an ultimate cause. In addition, he directly opposes the second of the principles, on which the cosmological or causal argument for God's existence rests, by the teaching that a cause must be contingent, and that an ultimate, or necessary, being cannot, therefore, be a cause. For cause, he points out, is precisely that which stands in necessary relation both to its effect and to its own cause as well. That is to say, the supposedly ultimate being, if it were a cause, would need to have a cause, and so would cease being ultimate. In Kant's own words, every beginning presupposes a state of its cause. But a first beginning would presuppose a state which had no causal relation with a preceding cause. The ordinary way of meeting this difficulty is by the teaching that the supreme being, as necessary, is not subject to the law of contingent causality. But this ejection of the ultimate cause from the series of contingent phenomena destroys the whole cosmological argument, for that infers the existence of God precisely as the highest term of the series of the contingent. With the highest being, Kant repeats, to remain in the chain of conditions it would itself be a member of the series, and like the lower members of which it is the presupposition, there would be need of investigating its higher ground. If, on the other hand, he adds, the highest being be separated from this chain, and if, by virtue of being a merely intelligible being, it be not conceived in the series of nature causes, what bridge can reason build in order to reach the nature series, i.e., in order to connect the alleged necessary cause with the contingent things which it is inferred to explain? Besides showing in this fashion that the cosmological argument is invalid, Kant points out that it is incomplete. It attempts to prove only the existence of an ultimate cause, and, in this respect inferior to the ontological argument, it cannot teach what sort of attributes the necessary being has. The last of the traditional arguments for God's existence arises to supplement the causal argument in this particular. It is known to Kant as the physico-theological argument, but is more commonly known as the teleological argument, or the argument from design. Toward this reasoning Kant has a temperamental regard, due to his interest in natural science, for the physico-theological argument finds in the order and majesty of nature a reason for inferring the existence of an absolutely necessary and all-perfect creator. Kant states the argument thus. 1. In the world are found everywhere clear tokens of an order which follows a definite purpose, and this purpose is carried out with great wisdom, and in a whole of indescribable manifoldness. 2. This purposed order is utterly foreign to the things in the world, and belongs to them only accidentally, that is to say, different things could not unite to definite ends, were they not chosen and disposed through an ordering, reasoning principle. 3. Therefore, there exists a sublime and wise cause, or several of them, which is intelligence and freedom must be cause of the world. This proof, Kant says, deserves ever to be named with respect. It is the oldest, the clearest proof, and most suited to ordinary human reason. It vivifies the study of nature, and itself has its source in the renewal of its strength through nature study. It supplies purposes and aims where our observation had not of itself discovered them, and widens our knowledge of nature through the guiding thread of a special unity. Yet though the reasonableness and the utility of the argument appeal to Kant so strongly that they arouse him to one of his rare enthusiasms, he nonetheless insists that this method of proof carries with it no absolute certainty. For the argument is, after all is said, an argument from the nature of an effect, the well-ordered world, to a cause. In other words, this argument from design is a case under the cosmological argument, and since it has been proved unjustifiable to reason from any effect to the existence of a necessary cause, any particular case of this reasoning must be discredited. And even if one had already granted the existence of a first cause, this effort to show that the Creator is of free intelligence would fail of convincing force, since it is but an argument from the analogy of certain nature products with that which human art creates. Because a human being would need thought and will in order to create objects comparable to the wonders of nature and the majesty of the world, we have, Kant argues, no right to argue that the unknown cause of nature is intellect and will. So Kant concludes his discussion of the three traditional arguments for God's existence. Outside these three paths, he says, no other lies open to the speculative reason, and he questions whether any proof be possible of a proposition so sublimely above all empirical use of the understanding. The reader of Kant will echo his doubt, if once he admits that these are the only arguments for God's existence. For Kant's strictures on them surely are justified. From the observation of ordered nature it is, indeed, impossible to argue demonstratively to the existence of an infinite intelligence as its creator. No empirical argument can suffice to establish the existence of a logical contradiction, namely, a first cause, and, finally, the mere consciousness which I possess of a perfect being, logically possible though it is, cannot guarantee the existence of such a being. If there be, then, no other argument for the existence of God, the conception truly must be viewed after Kant's fashion, as an ideal of the speculative reason. But Kant himself, as will appear elsewhere, suggests, what later philosophers amplify, another and, in the opinion of the writer, a valid proof of God's existence. And in this proof, when it shall disclose itself, we shall find no negation, but rather a transformation, of these discredited arguments. My consciousness will be shown to imply the existence of God as its deepest reality, and this is the soul of the ontological argument. My consciousness will be shown, furthermore, to imply the existence of God as its explanation, and this it is which the causal argument has tried to express. Finally, even the adaptations of nature may serve to illuminate our conception of God, and thus the teleological argument shall find its rightful, though subordinate, place. In conclusion, certain general comments on Kant's negative teaching must be made. It should be noted, in the first place, that his three negative doctrines have a varied bearing on his positive theory. The first, the doctrine that the things in themselves are unknown, makes no inroad whatever on the world of known reality. Its effect, if accepted, would be merely to impress upon us that there exists unknown reality, more ultimate than any which we know. On the other hand, the doctrine that we may not know either permanent selves or God seriously narrows the supposedly known world. In the second place, it must be emphasized that Kant asserts the existence of all three of these unknowns, things in themselves, selves, and God. With reference to God, this statement has later to be proved. But it has already appeared that Kant argues for the existence of the more than individual self, and every section of the critic bears witness to his constant assumption that things in themselves exist. The consequences of these admissions are elsewhere considered. D. Kant's correction of his negative doctrine. Kant's negative doctrine of the limits of knowledge. His teaching that the ultimate realities may not be known is very variously estimated by different critics. To certain students of Kant, for example, to Heine and to Herbert Spencer, the teaching that ultimate reality, and, in particular, God and immortal selves, are unknown, seems to be the significant and the final result of Kant's teaching. The present writer, however, holds with many other students and commentators that this negative doctrine of the limits of our knowledge is neither an essential nor a permanently significant teaching of Kant. The reasons for this conclusion have been indicated in the criticism of Kant's teaching that the transcendental I is unknown and that objective reality independent of consciousness exists. But a further reason for rejecting Kant's negative doctrine is found in the fact that he himself corrects and thus virtually retracts it by his teaching concerning the nominal object in the moral self. In other words, though unquestionably he teaches that ultimate realities, whether things or selves, are unknown, he nonetheless suggests the possibility of known things in themselves, and with glorious inconsistency he implies and even asserts that the moral self is known. This correction of his metaphysics by his ethics carries with it, as will appear, a most significant extension of his positive philosophy. 1. Kant's admission that things in themselves might be known, the hypothesis of the noumena. In the very chapter on phenomena and noumena in which Kant most definitely formulates his teaching that the ultimately real things in themselves are unknown, there is contained a curious qualification of this doctrine of the limits of knowledge. This corrective teaching, ignored in the preceding summary of the thing in itself doctrine, is as follows. 1. The reason why things in themselves are unknown is that all our knowledge includes sense, and that sense consciousness is incapable of apprehending reality. Were there, then, Kant says, an immediate knowledge untainted by sense, it might know even ultimate realities, and these known realities, or things in themselves, would be noumena, things thought about. Now, too, such unsensuous knowledge is, Kant admits, conceivable. The concept of a noumenon, that is, of a thing which shall be thought wholly through a pure understanding, not as an object of the senses, but as a thing in itself, is not at all contradictory. For one surely cannot assume that sensibility is the only possible form of intuition and showing. But, Kant adds, 3. We do not possess this unsensuous yet immediate knowledge. Our concepts are mere forms of thought for our sense perceptions, and, therefore, 4. The bare idea of noumena, namely things in themselves as objects of thought, is no guarantee of the existence of these knowable things in themselves, but is a mere Grenzbegriff, a limitative concept by which to check the presumption of the sense consciousness. So Kant ends by reaffirming the doctrine that the ultimately real things in themselves are unknown. But he has gone so far as to suggest that they might be known, that there is nothing contradictory in conceiving them as known. He has done more than this. He has clearly implied that the ultimate realities, if known, would no longer be independent of consciousness. They would be objects of thought, and therefore related to mind, and yet they would be ultimate. Thus, in two directions, by suggesting that ultimate reality might be known and by implying that, as known, it would no longer be independent of consciousness, Kant has made, by his hypothesis of the noumenon, at least a move toward the correction of the thing in itself doctrine. 2. Kant's admissions that the real self is known. A. The teaching that I am conscious of the real, or transcendental, self. Far more significant than this only half-serious suggestion that things in themselves might be known, is Kant's restoration of the real self to the domain of the known. It is fair to say that the things in themselves, empty of all predicates, would have been no great loss to us, but the denial of our ability to know selves deprives us of our most valued certainty. With distinct relief, therefore, a reader who takes his Kant seriously finds the real self not only restored to the world of known reality, but enriched with new and significant character. It has been shown already, by repeated quotations, that Kant admits the fact that I am conscious of my real self, not merely of the complex feeling of the moment, but of my underlying, my permanent, my real self. He has, it is true, withheld the name of knowledge from this mere consciousness of self, but this doctrine that we do not know a self of which we are and must be conscious is, as has appeared, an absurdity due wholly to Kant's artificial and unjustifiable conception of knowledge. He denies that the consciousness of the transcendental self is a knowledge of it, purely because he holds 1. That knowledge is sensational, and thus of the momentary, and 2. That knowledge involves an actual opposition between subject and object. But it can neither be maintained that sensational knowledge is inherently illusory, nor yet that knowledge requires an absolute subject-object contrast. There is consequently no force in Kant's contention that the consciousness of self is not a knowledge of self. It must be true, on the other hand, that the consciousness of the transcendental self is the knowledge of at least one undoubted and more than momentary reality. But besides this unacknowledged implication of the known self, the critic contains Kant's definite teaching that the moral self is an object of knowledge. The consideration of this teaching follows. B. Kant's teaching that I know the moral self is real. Up to this point we have concerned ourselves exclusively with what Kant calls his theoretical philosophy, and have taken no account of his ethical doctrine. Kant himself intends to make a sharp distinction between metaphysics and ethics, theoretical and moral philosophy, but an absolute line of cleavage is not possible. Ethics, like metaphysics, involves a doctrine of the human self and, in Kant's view, a theory, positive or negative, of God. Therefore ethics cannot be divorced from metaphysics, and what Kant and his critics call his moral philosophy is really, in the main, an integral part of his metaphysical system. The core of Kant's ethical system is his doctrine of obligation, and this doctrine involves the teaching that the real self, as a moral self, is known. His teaching may be summarized as follows. In the consciousness of obligation, a man knows himself, not as mere phenomenon, but as a reality, deeper than all phenomena, a self which is more than a mere series of temporally linked feelings. In the moral consciousness, in a word, a man knows himself as absolute reality. Kant's meaning will become clearer by a closer scrutiny of his doctrine of obligation. It contains 4 main articles. 1. The consciousness or feeling of obligation is a fact of our experience. 2. The feeling of obligation differs radically from every sensational or affective experience. 3. The feeling of obligation cannot be accounted for by a preceding succession of phenomena. Therefore, 4. The consciousness of obligation implies the existence of a free, that is, a transcendental, and ultimately real, self. These different teachings must now be repeated in Kant's own words. 1. The consciousness of obligation exists. I am, Kant says, immediately conscious of the moral law. How this consciousness of moral laws is possible cannot, he says, be further explained, for the feeling of obligation is an inexplicable fact. The moral law, he says, a little later, meaning by moral law the consciousness of obligation, is given as a fact of pure reason of which we are a priori conscious, and which is apodictically certain. 2. The feeling of obligation differs absolutely from the desire or the impulse. It is a distinct experience, a consciousness sui generis. The I ought feeling, in other words, is not equivalent to the I wish, or to the it would be pleasanter, more expedient, more advantageous. Kant makes use of many expressions to sharpen this distinction. He contrasts the feeling of obligation, under the name categorical imperative, with the desire, as hypothetical imperative, and he further distinguishes the moral law from the subjective maxim. Obligation, Kant says, expresses a sort of necessity, which occurs nowhere else in nature. It is impossible that anything in nature ought to be other than in fact it is. In truth, obligation, if one has before one's eyes only the succession in nature, has simply and solely no meaning. We can as little ask what ought to happen in nature as what attributes a circle ought to have. From the assertion of the absolute difference between the feeling of obligation and empirical desires or wishes, Kant proceeds, 3, to the doctrine that the feeling of obligation cannot be adequately explained as due merely to preceding phenomena of the inner life or of the outer world. The preceding facts of our mental condition may serve to explain for us why we wish such and such an end, or act in such and such a way, but they can never explain our sense of duty. There may be, he says, in the paragraph following that last quoted, never so many nature causes or sensuous impulses which drive me to volition. They cannot create obligation. The objective reality of the moral law, he says elsewhere, can be proved by no a posteriori deduction, and nonetheless it stands fast on its own merits, were sich selbst. The moral law, he says again, is a fact absolutely inexplicable by all data of the sense world. 4. But just because the feeling of obligation is inexplicable from the standpoint of temporal causality, it is seen inevitably to imply the existence of a self which is deeper, realer, than the phenomena. The feeling of obligation is, in other words, no mere phenomenon, no purely momentary consciousness. It is rather the expression of a self which is conscious of obligation, and which, just because it knows it ought, also knows that it may. Thus the consciousness of obligation is inextricably bound up with the consciousness of the freedom of the willing self. One knows that one can act because one is conscious that one ought, and thus one knows in oneself the freedom which, without the moral law, had remained unknown. From this ethical standpoint, therefore, Kant restates the distinction between the empirical and the transcendental ego, as that between the temporally caused and the free self, or as that between the phenomenally caused and the intelligibly causal self. From the first, the empirical, point of view, I am the complex feeling of this particular moment, and this complex feeling is the result of the inner feeling, and of the outer phenomenon of the preceding moment. In a word, I am the product of my experience and of my environment. But, regarding myself, as I may and must, not merely as a series of conscious experiences, but as the self which ought and can, I am outside the series of temporal feelings. This means that the self which, superficially regarded, is a series of facts of consciousness is, from a deeper point of view, an active subject, handeln subject. The empirical character is, in fact, Kant says, the mere manifestation, Erscheinung, of the intelligible. Thus, the same action which from one point of view is a pure nature result may from another standpoint be regarded as a manifestation of freedom. For with reference to the intelligible character, there is no before or after, and every act, without regard to its temporal relation to other phenomena, is the immediate working of the intelligible character, which consequently acts freely without being dynamically determined in the chain of nature causes, either through external or internal antecedent grounds. The teaching about the real self of the ethical experience is well summarized in the following statement. Man is one of the phenomena of the sense world, and he, too, is insofar one of the nature causes whose causality must stand under empirical laws. As such, he must have an empirical character, but man, who knows all the rest of nature only through sense, knows, Kant, himself also through mere apperception, and indeed in activities and inner determinations which he cannot count among sense impressions. He is certainly, therefore, on the one hand, phenomenon to himself, but on the other hand, in consideration of a certain capacity, he is a purely intelligible object. The last words of the quotation show unequivocally that Kant regards the moral self both as known self and as absolute reality, yes, as thing in itself. For this exact expression, heretofore reserved by Kant to describe the ultimate reality independent of consciousness, is applied in these sections to self and its moral activity. Intelligible causality is designated as the activity of a thing in itself, and later the intelligible character, that is the character of the moral self, is explicitly called the character of the thing in itself. The comparison of these conclusions with the negative results of Kant's philosophy leads almost inevitably to a reconstruction. Kant has argued, before he comes to the consideration of the moral experience, that the true or transcendental self is unknowable, and that beyond the reach of knowledge lie certain unattainable realities. In the course of his argument he has, it is true, been guilty of extreme inconsistency. He has really implied that the transcendental self is known, and that the ultimate realities are objects within, and not beyond, consciousness. Yet he has clung persistently to the existence of the unknowable world beyond experience. Now, in the study of the moral consciousness, Kant suddenly discovers that here, at least, in the consciousness of duty and the knowledge of freedom, the true self comes to know itself. And this true self, no mere series of events dependent one on another, is, Kant sees, an ultimate reality. But if both assertions be admitted, if the self is an ultimate reality and if this reality can be known, then it is no longer possible to hold that ultimate reality is, of necessity, beyond our knowledge. On the other hand, it becomes probable that ultimate reality will turn out to be a self or a related system of selves. Kant himself implies, though he does not prove, the truth of this Berkeley-like hypothesis by the further teachings of his ethics. See Kant's teaching that the free, moral self must be member of a society of blessed and immortal selves. Kant's starting point, as has been shown, is the immediate certainty of a feeling of obligation distinct from desire. The impossibility of deriving this from temporal or empirical causes has led him, in the first place, to insist on the existence of a self deeper than phenomena. In the second place, the fact that no empirical derivation of the feeling of obligation can be found has convinced Kant of its validity. The foundation of the greater part of the positive philosophy, constructed by Kant from the ethical standpoint, is therefore, as should be noted, not the initial assertion of the bare existence of a feeling of obligation, but the later inference of its validity. Or, to state this differently, Kant believes, not merely in the feeling, but in the fact, of obligation, not merely that there is a feeling of obligation, but also that there is obligation, independently of the purely individual admission of it. The existence of the feeling of obligation must imply, Kant teaches, the existence of a more than phenomenal self. The validity of the feeling of obligation, the existence, in other words, of obligation, implies, Kant goes on to show, the freedom, the blessedness, and the immortality of selves who are members of a kingdom of related selves. This acknowledgement that the world of the moral self is a social world of interrelated individuals is made by reason of Kant's study of what he calls the content of the moral law. A consideration of his specifically ethical doctrine is, therefore, necessary, as a means to the understanding of his doctrine of the ultimately real and related selves. After Kant has established the existence of obligation, and after he has taught that a self is free to do what it ought, the question arises: what then, ought I, the moral self, to do? What, definitely, is my duty? In what terms is the categorical imperative expressed? Now Kant adopts, at different times, two attitudes, which he does not clearly differentiate, toward this problem. When he is chiefly concerned to establish the utter distinctness of the ought feeling from desire, he defines the object of obligation in almost negative terms. The object of desire is the pleasurable, but the feeling of obligation is utterly opposed to desire. Hence, Kant teaches, that which one ought to do cannot be pleasurable. The pure idea of duty must be unmixed with any foreign ingredient of sensuous desire. Furthermore, because the object of desire is always some definite object, and because obligation is opposed to desire, therefore, so Kant teaches, in this phase of his ethical doctrine, obligation has no definite object. The single principle of morality, he says, consists in independence of all matter of the law, that is, of every object of desire, and in the determination of the will, Wilker, by the mere universal form of law, Gesetzgebende form. This means that the fundamental principle of duty, the basal formulation of the moral law, is simply this: do whatever you are conscious that you ought to do. Whether or not you can formulate your duty beforehand, whether or not you can a priori define that which is right, so much is certain. You ought at any time to do that which you think that you ought. Empty as it is, this mere form of a law does supply a principle for moral action. Critics of Kant have, however, rightly laid stress on the unsatisfactoriness of this purely formal law, and have claimed, with reason, that a system of absolute ethics should define a specific object of obligation in order to justify the validity of obligation. As a matter of fact, Kant does elsewhere suggest a positive content for the moral law, a positive definition of duty. This is the second form of Kant's ethical doctrine. In brief, he teaches that the object of obligation is the good of humanity, and by this teaching he, of course, implies the existence of a society of selves. This positive form of Kant's moral doctrine is well summarized in the Metaphysic of Morality by the two successive statements of the moral law, or imperative. The first of these is the following: act in conformity with that maxim, only, which thou canst, will to be a universal law. And by this Kant means, a right action is an action which every man might repeat without thereby injuring society. The positive content of the moral law, thus formulated, is evidently, then, the preservation of a society of related selves. This is more clearly indicated in the second statement of the practical imperative, which, though it still leaves undefined the nature of the personal end, yet unambiguously conceives of this end as social, never purely individual. This second and more concrete form of the practical imperative is the following: act so as to use humanity both in thine own person and in the person of another, always as an end, never merely as a means. Kant's meaning is that the moral action no longer regards the desires and needs of the individual, except as the individual belongs to the related whole of selves which he calls humanity, Menschheit, and describes as a kingdom. The systematic union of different reasoning beings through common laws. It should be added in qualification of the social nature of this ideal, that, in Kant's view, the universal system of laws to which each member of society is subject are laws which he imposes upon himself, and he is only under obligation to act in conformity with his own will. This teaching is of great significance. For to say that the common laws of society are laws self-imposed by the individual is simply to say that the individual is of necessity a social self constituted by its relations to others, so that the existence of one individual presupposes the existence of related individuals. At this second point, therefore, Kant's study of the moral consciousness leads him to widen his conception of reality. He has already seen that the moral consciousness implies the existence of the more than phenomenal self. He now discovers that the validity of the moral consciousness, the fact of obligation, requires him to conceive of the self as no isolated individual, but as a related self, a member of humanity, a citizen of the kingdom of rational human beings. To these interrelated moral selves, Kant attributes three chief characters: freedom, immortality, and blessedness. These must be further discussed. 1. It has been shown already, by quotations from both critics, that Kant teaches the freedom of the self. It must now be pointed out that he seems to use this term in at least two ways. On the one hand, he shows that in the consciousness of obligation, one is aware of a self which is deeper than any series of feelings, and which is, therefore, ontologically free, in other words, free from, or independent of, the laws of phenomenal relation. It is a moot point whether Kant believes in freedom in a second, the merely ethical sense, that is to say, whether he teaches that the moral self has the choice between good and ill. In the opinion of the present writer, Kant does, in certain passages, unequivocally teach that the fact of obligation implies that the moral man is free to do good or ill. This is the most obvious meaning of the passage, already quoted. Man affirms that he can because he is conscious that he ought. It is still more plainly implied in the well-known words du kannst and du sollst. The implication of these statements certainly seems to be, obligation is impossible unless there be responsibility, a power to act in one way or in the other. Kant's occasional references to a will which is not good, or to a will influenced by sensuous desires imply even more clearly that the real self, the unphenomenal self, has the freedom to be good or bad. To sum up, Kant teaches that the individual selves in the kingdom of selves are free, in the sense of being selves, not mere complexes of ideas, and that this is implied by the mere consciousness of obligation. At times, also, Kant seems to teach that the fact of obligation implies the ethical freedom of these individuals to work good or ill. 2. The immortality of human selves, Kant teaches, is a second implication of the fact of obligation. For the very first requirement of the moral law is complete conformity with the law, action in accordance with the feeling of obligation. Now this complete conformity to the moral law, Kant says, is holiness, a perfection of which no rational being of the sense world is capable at any point of time of his existence. Since, however, holiness is demanded as practically necessary, it can be found only in an infinite progress toward that full conformity, and it is necessary to assume such practical advance as the real object of our will. Thus Kant teaches the necessity of immortality as requisite to the fulfillment of obligation. The conception is certainly invigorating. Is it, however, logically necessary? The question which at once suggests itself is this: does Kant here contradict his own conception of the moral self as out of the temporal series, by the suggestion that it fails of its aim at a particular moment? To this it may be replied that according to Kant, every action is part of a temporal series, as well as a manifestation of the timeless self. Now it is only of the temporal self that one may say, it must be immortal as surely as it has obligation, or duties. For duties must be capable of fulfillment and cannot be fulfilled in a finite time. Thus the self which, as timeless, is eternal is, as temporal moral self, immortal. 3. Still another implication of duty, or obligation, is named by Kant in a section preceding the just summarized. Kant calls it the implication of a highest good. The existence of the highest good follows, Kant says, from the fact of obligation, simply and precisely because the highest good is the object of obligation, the content of the moral law. The highest good, he says, is necessarily the supreme end of a morally determined will. We ought, he says later, to seek to further the highest good, and the highest good must certainly, therefore, be possible. Kant thus attains a further definition of the object of duty. As conceived in the metaphysics of morality, the object of the moral law is regarded, first, as conformity with consciousness of obligation, whatever its content, a state to which the argument for immortality seems to refer as holiness, and is, second, defined simply and vaguely as the end shared by humanity, the kingdom of selves related by common laws. In the section now considered, Kant goes farther and describes duty as the obligation to attain the highest good. Now the highest good, Kant teaches, must be both supreme and complete. The supreme good is evidently virtue, or holiness, the conformity with the sense of duty. As complete, however, the highest good must include not merely virtue, but happiness also. Virtue is the supreme good, but it is not, for that reason, the whole and complete good, as object of the desire of rational, finite beings. The complete good demands happiness also, and that not only to the prejudiced view of the person who makes an end of himself, but in the judgment of unprejudiced reason which regards happiness in the world as an end in itself. For if we imagine a reasonable and at the same time all-powerful being, it cannot accord with the complete will of such a being that there should be those who are in need of happiness and are worthy of it yet who do not possess it. Such happiness, Kant insists, in the effort to coordinate this teaching with the earlier sections of the Critic, though it is part of the object of duty, is not its determining motive or bestimmungsgrund. For only the moral law, the obligation to be true to one's sense of obligation, can determine the truly moral will. Reflection upon the tendency of moral actions and upon the explanation of the sense of obligation does, it is true, lead to the conclusion that the object of the moral consciousness, the ideal whose existence it implies, is the highest good. But every single moral act follows upon consciousness of obligation, not upon a calculation of the highest good. But this reasoning, spite of its guarded outcome, is even less cogent than the argument for immortality. For Kant urges the existence of the highest good only by an appeal to what he calls unprejudiced reason, and has no weapon with which to meet the opponent who should challenge his conviction. The failure of this argument, as will appear, invalidates Kant's practical proof of the existence of God. 3. Kant's teaching that the existence of God is postulated by the moral consciousness. The search for the implication of the moral consciousness not only leads Kant to the doctrine that a society of free and immortal and finally blessed selves exists, but assures him also of the existence of God. Kant argues that God must exist in order that the highest good be possible, that is, in order that happiness should follow upon virtue. A finite moral being cannot order events so as to secure happiness, therefore God must exist to supply that happiness, which is a factor in the highest good. All this is very clearly and simply stated by Kant. It has been admitted that it is our duty to promote the highest good, and hence it is not only allowable, but it is even a necessity demanded by duty, that we should presuppose the possibility of this highest good. And as this possibility can be presupposed only on the condition that God exists, the presupposition of the highest good is inseparably bound up with duty, that is, it is morally necessary to hold to the existence of God. There is certainly nothing more surprising in all that Kant has written, nothing more inconsistent with his rigorous temperament and his severe outlook upon life, than this argument for a God who is needed in order to give mere happiness. The argument, as has been shown, depends upon the preceding demonstration that happiness must coexist with virtue. And since this last assertion was unproved, the practical argument for God's existence goes with it. Yet the failure of this argument is no disproof of the wider proposition that the facts of the moral life demand God's existence. Fichte, and especially Hegel, later take up Kant's argument at this point, and argue that a moral self and, the more surely, that a kingdom of related moral selves, presuppose the existence of an all-including self, who is himself the highest good, to share whose reality is immortality and life. In conclusion, there is need to remind ourselves that Kant makes a curious and, as will be argued, an unwarranted distinction between the assurance based on the facts of moral experience, and that which has what he calls a theoretical basis. The latter alone he names knowledge, whereas assurance of the former kind he calls postulate or faith. For to Kant knowledge always includes sense perception, and, therefore, the awareness of self. The friend of God must needs bear another name. Through practical reason, he says, we know neither the nature of our soul, nor the intelligible world, nor God as they are in themselves. We have only the conceptions of them united in the practical conception of the highest good as the object of our will. It is, however, of utmost importance to realize that though Kant taught what Tennyson later sung, we have but faith, we cannot know, for knowledge is of things we see, he nonetheless attributes to the believed or postulated objects of the practical reason all the reality of known objects. Over and over again he says this. Freedom, immortality, and God, he declares, gain objective reality through an apodictic practical law, as necessary conditions of the possibility of that which the law commands, shall be its object. He even adds that theoretical knowledge has been extended by being forced to admit that there are supersensible objects, though nothing definite is theoretically known of them. Only, therefore, his arbitrary limitation of the term knowledge prevents Kant from applying the word to our consciousness of self and of God. The critics who represent Kant as teaching merely that there is a moral probability that God exists, or as teaching that we should act as if we knew that God exists, wholly misrepresent Kant's position. For Kant asserts positively and not doubtfully that a universe of moral selves and a God exist. Thus, to review Kant's ethical doctrine, it is evident that he rightly teaches that the facts of the moral consciousness presuppose the existence of a society of real and interrelated selves. But it is evident, also, that, though his main conclusions are thus justified, he does not succeed in demonstrating either the immortality and the blessedness of the individual, or the existence of God. For his arguments, in all three cases, are of a traditional and empirical nature, and he does not satisfactorily prove that immortality and happiness in God are implications of the moral consciousness. His main defect is, in truth, the failure to see that the argument from obligation is not the only one. That not merely the will, but the thought, the memory, yes, even the emotion and the sensation of the conscious experience, imply a self fundamental to ideas, which does not merely will, but which thinks, remembers, feels, and perceives. Such a self presupposes, as Kant clearly realized, though he argued it in so ineffective a way, a world of things which are mere objects for the self, a world of related finite selves, and a God who is the sum of all reality, who is, in truth, intelligence and will. These results so closely resemble those of the pre-Kantian idealists, Leibniz and Berkeley, that it is fair to ask ourselves, does Kant represent any significant advance upon their doctrine? Has he, in truth, done more than correct Hume's sensationalistic phenomenalism and Wolff's intellectualistic dualism, so as to swing philosophy back from Hume and Wolff to Berkeley, and to Leibniz? Measured by the standard of its progress toward idealism, is not Kant's system, indeed, a retrogression, since he asserts the existence of things in themselves? Or, if it be assumed that Kant finally interprets the things in themselves as free selves, the postulates of the practical reason, is not his system less simply self-consistent than Berkeley's? And, if all these questions are affirmatively answered, a practical question will doubtless next be asked. What use is there, it will not unreasonably be urged, in the study of a text so intricate, so difficult, and so contradictory as Kant's? To this question there are, however, three answers, that is, there are three ways of justifying our study of Kant. Kant's influence has, in the first place, been far greater than that of Leibniz or of Berkeley. Berkeley had very little effect on continental or even on British philosophy, and Leibniz's doctrine was distorted by Wolff before it was fairly understood, whereas the post-Kantian German schools are built up on Kant's philosophy, and all philosophical works, up to our own day, presuppose an acquaintance with Kant's terms and with his argument. There is, in the second place, a certain methodological value in the hard-won character, and in the very slowness and incompleteness of Kant's thinking. The idealistic standpoint is opposed to that of our traditional doctrine, so that there seems to be something almost like sleight of hand in Leibniz's, and in Berkeley's lightning-like transformation of the world of independent things into the world of monads and souls. Kant's more grudging method is, for one type of mind at any rate, more convincing. He does not wish to yield the world of independent reality, and yet, bit by bit, he finds himself compelled to give up space, time, substance, causality, and at the end the very things in themselves threaten to turn into real selves. But, finally, there is in Kant's teaching a distinct advance, or at the very least the material for a distinct advance, both on Leibniz and on Berkeley. The great defect of each of these systems is, as was shown, its failure to show the relation between infinite and finite monads, or selves. Berkeley, for example, never explains how the infinite produces ideas in the finite mind, nor how the finite knows either the infinite or other human selves. But Kant, by his distinction between the empirical and the transcendental self, which are yet the same self, by his teaching that the moral consciousness presupposes related selves, recognizes the problem and suggests its solution. A completely satisfactory solution, it must be admitted, philosophy has never yet found.